Hello, in this session we are going to be looking at the anatomy of the muscular system, just a basic overall anatomy and some of the functions. We've covered some already in class, and from there we will be looking at the mechanics of the muscular system and providing a basic overview for how muscles adapt to a training stimulus or lack thereof. But what I'd like to do is start with a question, one that we will answer at the end of the session, but I'd like you to just ponder now for a moment. So you have somewhere in the region, depending on genetic variation, 640 skeletal muscles in your body. Skeletal muscles being the muscles that attach to your skeleton and provide movement. Why do we have so many? That to me seems like a excessively high number of skeletal muscles. Think about your quadriceps muscle group. You have four primary quadriceps. Why not just have one big quadriceps muscle? Why have four muscles that perform more or less the same function? Think on it, perhaps pause the video, maybe do a bit of research, and we will discuss it at the end of the session. We'll discuss the answer at the end of the session. So, let's move on. Okay, so this provides you an overview of the basic anatomy of a skeletal muscle, and we'll be working from the lowest level of organisation down here in the bottom right of the screen, all the way up here to the whole muscle itself. So while these aren't visible, because it's very difficult to show every level of organisation, but we begin with myofilaments. These are the individual proteins, for example you may have heard of myosin and actin, which make up a muscle essentially. They are the drivers of the active force that your skeletal muscles are able to produce. And when I say active force, I mean the conscious force that your muscles are able to exert, as opposed to a passive force, which would be a resistance to being stretched, for example. When we bundle myofilaments together in the correct way, we have a sarcomere, and we bundle sarcomeres together, but the sarcomeres are essentially the structural unit that produces force in the muscle. Once the myofilaments are organised, the sarcomeres are where the force originates from. Again, not visible on here, but that's more of a physiological topic, so we won't be delving into that too much. If we bundle many a sarcomere together, then we have a myofibron, and that is what we see here, this small red piece of string almost coming out of here. That is made up of sarcomeres added in parallel and in series, so next to each other and above each other and below each other. You could think of these as the individual strands in a thick piece of rope, perhaps. Now, if we bundle many myofibrils together, we're able to create the next level of organisation, which we can see here, which, again, on the wrong way, idiot, which is the muscle fibre. A muscle fibre is just the same as saying a muscle cell. So we refer to muscle fibres because muscle cells as having as muscle fibres because they have a fibrous appearance when viewed under a microscope. But they are cells, basically. They are the cells within your skeletal muscles. That is somewhat, well, I won't say unique, but unlike many of the cells in your body, so skin cells, for example, the cells that line your digestive tract and your respiratory system, they do not replicate. That is because when you think of a cell, we typically think of a circular structure with a little dot in the middle to represent the nucleus. And with a level of organisation like that, it's easy to replicate one cell into another. So one cellular membrane can divide and create two nuclei, and therefore we have mitosis and meiosis. But I digress slightly. Muscle fibers, however, are, or can be at least, extremely long. The fibers in your hamstrings or quadriceps, for example, can be up to 30 centimeters long, which is very long for an individual cell, but again, only nanometers wide. So because of this, the cell requires many nuclei. It is multinucleated. The nucleus is where the myofilaments are produced. So there are many nuclei spread throughout the cell, which makes it difficult, well, impossible in fact, for the cell to replicate. So you have as many muscle fibers now as you will ever have. If we bundle muscle fibers together, then we have the next level of organization. This is the first one, which is actually visible to the naked eye here, the fascicle. He says, there, the fascicle. And if you're ever eating a piece of meat, if you enjoy a Nando's, for example, or I don't know, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and you tear a piece of breast meat, for example, you'll see these thin strands throughout the muscle. These are fascicles. That's what you're seeing, is the fascicles of the muscle. When we group fascicles together, as you can see we've done here, then we finally have a muscle, the organ of the muscle. A muscle, skeletal muscle, is an organ in the same way that your heart or your brain, for example, is an organ. And this is all held together via connective tissue. Now, in order to keep each of these muscle fibers, myofibrils, and the muscle itself separate yet also held together and connected, we have various layers of connective tissue which permeate throughout the muscle but are all interconnected. So, for example, each muscle fiber is wrapped in its own protective layer known as the endomysium. You can see that here, this light grey area around the cell. The fascicles are held together with a level of connective tissue called the perimysium, you can see here. And the muscle itself has a protective sheath that wraps around it called the epimysium. Part of this is to protect the muscle and to reduce friction when it comes into contact with other organs. So the purpose of these, as I say, is to hold the muscle together and at the same time to protect the fibers, the fascicles, and the muscle itself. Part of the reason we cook meat is obviously so it's palatable and we can eat it safely, but also to destroy the connective tissue in there. When you say something's got a bit of gristle in it, it's not been cooked properly because the method that's been used has obviously not heated the meat up enough to get rid of that particular piece of connective tissue, so it's still there. So there we are. So let's look at some basic muscle anatomy. We have here the biceps brachii. We all know the biceps brachii as being our primary elbow flexor. And again, this is just general overall anatomy. So where the muscle attaches to the skeleton, and you can see the biceps brachii has 3 points of attachment, we have individual tendons which slowly merge into the muscle itself. And the moment at which this occurs, the transition from tendon to muscle occurs, we call the myotendinous junction. It's rather hard to pinpoint an exact area, but roughly in this area where we're going from white to red. It's around here. Now, the attachments have specific terms in biomechanics based on their location. So attachments that are closer to the midline of the body, as a rule, this is for the majority of skeletal muscles, not all of them necessarily, but for the majority, are called the origin of the muscle. And as you can see, the biceps brachii has two origins. The short head of the biceps brachii, which is this inner head here, the one that's nearest to, originates from what is called the coracoid process on the scapula, shoulder blade back here. And the long head, the outer head here, also attaches to the scapula on what is called the supraglenoid tubercle, but that's perhaps getting a bit advanced for what we need to know here. We then have the muscle belly itself. This is where we find our sarcomeres and our active muscle tissue, where the active force is produced, and the insertion at, the attachment at the opposite end of the muscle, which is furthest from the midline, we call the insertion. So in this case, the biceps brachii inserts into, it's simplified a bit here, but that's to say the connective tissue on your forearm. There are several points of insertion, but it's a bit complicated for what we have, or what we need to know here. The main takeaway point here is origin near the body, insertion away from the body, muscle belly in the middle. So, functions of a muscle can be more complex than initially thought. The biceps brachii is, as we know, our primary elbow flexor. So active engagement of the biceps brachii will flex the elbow, bring the hand up towards the shoulder. This is what we do when we perform, say, a bicep curl in the gym, elbow flexion. But many muscles have secondary functions where they perform some support roles along with other muscles. For example, the biceps brachii is also responsible, or also supports and helps in shoulder flexion, believe it or not. It is also a powerful, as we've discussed, elbow supinator, or forearm, I suppose you could say supinator, elbow, forearm, supinator. So this is where if you have your palm facing down and turn it upwards to face the ceiling, that's supination. And finally, during shoulder abduction, the biceps brachii acts to stabilize the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint. And one way that we know that muscles produce particular, or responsible and support particular functions, is when someone's injured. For example, if you've torn one or more of the attachments of a muscle, let's say the biceps brachii, then we know that shoulder flexion is impaired, so it must play a role in shoulder flexion, as is elbow supination and glenohumeral stabilization. So it's not the only way we know, but it's how we first started to identify that skeletal muscles have many complicated roles, and it does get tricky. But as we say, primary role of the biceps is elbow flexion, but it has several supporting roles in the body. Okay, a bit gross, but stick with me. Anatomical variation. We're all genetically different, and of course that is going to lead to variation in skeletal muscles. So what we have here is and apologies if you're grossed out by this, feel free to skip ahead if you're not keen on it, but an autopsy image of someone with 3 heads on their biceps brachii. So we have the long head here, so the outer long head, the inner short head, and a third inner head, which we would refer to as the humeral head. And this is most often seen in Asian populations. Roughly 20-25% have this variation in their biceps. So what I'm trying to get across is it's whilst we understand the basic anatomy of the body, there is always variation. And finally, this is my bit of pub quiz knowledge. When you think of the quadriceps femoris muscle group and think how many individual muscles are there, you would tend to say, well, there's 4. There's the vastus medialis here, vastus intermedius here, vastus lateralis here, and not shown is the rectus femoris, which attaches down here and originates up here on the pelvis. But it's amazing how much we are still finding out about the anatomy of the human body. A study in 2016, an autopsy study, first identified, and in 2016, we've been doing autopsies for a long time, identified that there was an additional muscle here, which no one had described in any anatomy textbook, and it's referred to as the tensor vastus intermedius. It's no big muscle by any stretch of the imagination, and it's connected via a series of connective tissue with the vastus intermedius. But that is our 5th quadriceps muscle. Would you believe there is also a 6th, which I haven't put on here because it's a very small and somewhat pathetic little muscle, called the genu articularis, but you can look it up. It's a tiny muscle, about the size of a stamp if you turned it on its side, but it has all the properties of a muscle. It has muscle belly and tendon at either end, so it's quite a wide muscle with obviously attachments, and its role is to stabilize the patella, but because it connects with the quadriceps via a series of connective tissue, it's considered a quadriceps muscle. So if anyone asks you how many quadriceps muscles do you have, you can now confidently say 6. Just a bit of bonus information for you there. 2016 we learnt about this muscle. Bizarre. Still amazes me. How did no one spot it before then? If you ever find the paper, it's quite easy to find. The authors just say that people have been noticing it for years, but couldn't be bothered to make anything of it because they didn't think it had played much of a role in lung function. Well, it probably doesn't, but still surprises me. Anyway, let's move on. Now, in mechanical terms, we describe muscles and we classify them based on the number of joints which they cross. So in order for a muscle to produce movement, it has to cross a joint, because a joint is where the rotation, the movement, the angular rotation occurs around. So again, sticking with the quadriceps here, sticking with the traditional 4, but there's really 6, don't tell anyone. On the left-hand side here, we have the collectively known as the vasti muscle group, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus medialis, so medialis, intermedius, lateralis. They span over a singular joint, the tibiofemoral joint of the knee, which is responsible for knee flexion and extension. And we refer to any muscle which spans over one joint as being monoarticular. Sorry, I've cropped off the R there from monoarticular, but monoarticular, mono singular, one, articulation. So when these muscles are recruited, they produce articulation about one single joint, i.e. knee extension. However, the rectus femoris here on the right hand side of the screen which is also a quadriceps muscle, as we said, spans over not only the tibiofemoral joint, but also the hip joint, the acetabulofemoral joint, and is thus known as a biarticular muscle. It spans over, bi meaning two, bicep. It spans over two joints, therefore it is able to produce or support knee extension and hip flexion. So it plays two roles within the body. There are some muscles, your gastrocnemius for example, that span over more than two, three in fact, joints, but there's no specific term given to them. I would call them triarticular, but there we are. We typically, and this is a generalization, but typically if there's an issue with the muscle, it's very often the biarticular muscles which cause many of our injuries and problems and issues that we need to have sorted by a physio or a physician. It's the monoarticular muscles don't seem to be as much trouble. That's a generalization. Again, there are obviously cases, but generally it seems to be more the biarticular muscles. But the reason for that is a story for another day. Okay then, muscle actions. So what we have here is the hamstring muscle group, the posterior portion of the thigh here, the gastrocnemius, and the quadriceps. So when the muscle turns green, it means it's actively engaging. When it's red, it means it's passively lengthening. Just so you know what's going on there. So when a muscle actively shortens, it is said to be concentrically shortening. We refer to this as an action and not a contraction of the muscle. We don't tend to use the term muscle contraction too much, and I'll get to the reason why in a moment. We would say a muscle action. So when the quadriceps turn green here, they are concentrically contracting, they are actively shortening. Now, if a muscle actively lengthens, the reverse is happening. So it is producing active force to lengthen in response to its agonist, the agonist muscle shortening. So here this movement is occurring very slowly. So when we have knee extension, say, here, the movement occurs so slow that the antagonist muscles here, the hamstrings and the calf muscles, just passively lengthen. But if you're kicking a ball, say, if this movement was occurring a lot quicker, then the muscle needs to provide a braking force to slow the movement down, to prevent injury to the tibiofemoral joint. And in that case, we have an eccentric muscle action. If we have a scenario where active force is being produced but no movement occurs, then the muscle is said to be producing an isometric muscle action. And this is the reason why we don't use the term contraction, because contraction suggests movement. In the case of an isometric muscle action, there is force being produced, but it's not producing any movement. It is just holding a limb or a particular structure in the body in place, but not moving it around. One other term that you may come across in your reading, but you need to be very wary of, is a term called an isotonic muscle action. And if you read it, disregard it and think of it as nonsense. An isotonic muscle action is one where the muscle is able to produce the same amount of force all the way through its range of motion, which is impossible. A muscle cannot produce the same amount of force all the way through its range of motion. The reason this term was invented was because early studies into muscle mechanics were done in isolated frog muscles, would you believe, which were put in a saline bath and had force transducers attached, and in that situation, yes, you can create a contraction where the same amount of force is produced from fully shortening to lengthening, but that doesn't happen in the human body. So if you come across the term isotonic, do please disregard it. Stick with concentric, eccentric, or isometric. So muscle architecture. When we refer to muscle architecture, we're really referring to the gross anatomy of the muscle. And this can be broken down into very crudely, and there is variation depending on which textbook you read, but this can be broken down into either parallel or pennate. Muscles are parallel or pennate. Parallel muscles, on the whole, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself, have their fascicles running in line with the attachments of the muscle. So they are in parallel with the tendons. A good example of this would be the Sartorius muscle here. This is the longest muscle in your body. It originates from the front of your pelvis, the anterior superior iliac spine, and inserts down on the tibia, as you can just about see there. It is sometimes referred to as the cobbler's muscle or the tailor's muscle, depending on which book you read, because if you sit upright with your knees bent to 90 degrees and your feet placed on the ground, and then cross your legs, bring one leg up over the other, that is the primary role of the Sartorius. We refer to muscles such as this as being strap muscles. This is where the fibers, the fascicles, are perfectly in line with the insertion of the muscle. This means it's a weak muscle, it's not particularly strong, but it can produce motion fairly quickly. Other parallel muscles include the biceps brachii. This is a fusiform muscle. For the most part, the fibers within the muscle are in line with the attachment of the muscle, but there is some deviation. So being a parallel muscle, again, any parallel muscles are not your strong, powerful, large force producing muscles. They are able to produce speed. They are speedy movements, basically. The biceps brachii is not a muscle that will respond well to heavy resistance exercise because it doesn't have the architecture to do that. You will hit your 1 repetition max with the bicep very quickly because it's a weak muscle fundamentally. So any of you out there do resistance training, it's best to train this muscle with more repetitions, more sets, and less load. Finally, we have the third type of parallel muscle, which is the strongest, let's say, of the three. It's able to produce the greatest amount of force, and it is the triangular muscle. There aren't too many triangular muscles in the body. Best example would be the Pectoralis Major. Excuse me. And the Pectoralis Major has 2 heads, much like the bicep. The sternocostal head, and here, which originates from the sternum, and the clavicular head, the upper pectoralis, which attaches or originates from the clavicle, and they both come together and merge with a common tendon at the humerus, or on the humerus. And I'm sure you can tell just by looking at the muscle why it's known as a triangular muscle. So at the origin, the fibers are distributed very widely, and they tighten up and get closer together as they reach the insertion. A pennate muscle is a muscle in which the fibers are at an oblique angle to the direction of pull of the muscle. So the fibers point away from the line of pull of the muscle. So if you think the bicep here has an attachment here, here and here, and when it's engaged the force that is produced is going to go in this direction. Okay, that's a parallel muscle. Well, a pennate muscle has fibers that are aligned away from this. So let's look at an example of those. You have a unipennate muscle, such as the outer gastrocnemius, or the outer head of the gastrocnemius here. A bipennate muscle, this is where the tendon of the muscle runs through the middle of the muscle, well, continues, I should say, through the muscle, and the fibers are arranged at about a 45-degree angle to this tendon. And finally, a multipennate muscle, and pretty much the only example I could think of would be your deltoids. Very often you'll see in, I don't know, Men's Health, Muscle and Health, I don't know, whatever they're called, magazines, that the deltoid is described as having 3 individual heads, frontal head, medial head and posterior. They're not heads, they're bundles of fibre. They don't classify as being individual heads of a muscle. You recruit one, you recruit all. Doesn't mean that you can't preferentially target the posterior and anterior fibres with exercise, but they're not heads, because they still, whilst there is some separation, they still merge in the middle here. So the pennate muscles are our force-producing muscles. They are our strong muscles. They are the muscles that we require to generate large, forceful activities. All of the quadriceps are pennate muscles. They don't produce the force particularly quickly, but they will produce more force than our parallel muscles. So again, surprisingly, when you think about it, that the pec major, despite you see people doing bench press and that, it's not actually a particularly strong muscle compared to others. So that is muscle architecture. Now let's look at some adaptations to exercise. And we're going to consider adaptation at various different levels, but it's important to understand that, think of the muscle that we looked at the very beginning, where we looked at the level of organisation of a muscle. Adaptation can occur at each level that we described. So for example, resistance training can result in changes in the type of myosin that is produced within the muscle. So the myosin or myofilament that is produced in response to training and in response to a exercise stimulus may shift, because we don't just have one type of myosin in our body. We have a variety, and some are able to generate more force than others. So myosin, actin, they are able to respond to different types of stimulus. At the level of the sarcomere, we can see a response to how sarcomeres are added to each other. Sarcomeres can be added in parallel. So each one of these structural units we see here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 sarcomeres here. If I was to add another one on the top and another one on the bottom, that would be adding a sarcomere in parallel. That will increase the strength of the muscle, increase how much force it can produce. So that would happen in response to resistance exercise, say. If, let's say, you were into your yoga or just did a lot of stretching, then this would result in serial sarcomerogenesis. So we still have our 4 sarcomeres here, but we add another 4 next to them. And serial sarcomerogenesis does not result in an increased force output for the muscle. So it's important to understand the difference between the two, parallel and serial sarcomerogenesis. Now, truth be told, with resistance exercise, particularly early on, if you're a novice, you will see parallel and serial sarcomerogenesis, because eccentrically lengthening the muscle will result in serial sarcomerogenesis, but there is just more parallel than there is serial. Next level, we will see changes in the myofiber size, so the muscle fiber size. Now, as we said, the muscle fibers themselves cannot replicate, and it's very important to remember, you cannot see a division in myocytes or muscle fibers. However, there are cells called satellite cells that are grouped together within muscle fibers that are able to basically produce and donate their nucleus to the muscle fiber so that it can produce more protein and therefore increase in its cross-sectional area. We also see changes in the passive tissue. Again, much like the changes that we see in the myofilaments, we can see stronger versions of, say, collagen or titin. Titin's the largest protein in your body, by the way, as a bonus fact. And collagen is the most common. It's people that get it injected into them. Why? You've got loads. But I digress. There are weaker and stronger isoforms of these proteins. In fact, the only non-passive proteins in a muscle are myosin and actin. Every other protein in the muscle is a connective protein. It's a passive protein, can't produce active force. You only get active force from myosin and actin. And finally, we will see changes in the overall architecture of the muscle. This might be an increase in cross-sectional area, for example. If you were to chop the muscle in half and look at its area pre and post exercise, not the nicest thing to do, but you would see a change. So we're going to divide mechanical stimuli into 4 basic categories. Imagine in the middle here is your current level of fitness and current level of daily activity. On the left hand side we have understretch, which simply means that your muscle will be kept in a shortened position more often than it normally is. So it is understretched, it is not lengthened as often as it normally is. Wearing high heels is a good example of this. This keeps the calf muscles in a shortened position and can result in several issues in the long term with the calves, but again, story for another day. And below that we have underloading. This is where there is simply less loading placed on the muscle than typically experienced. Conversely, the exact parallel of this on the right, overstretch, where your muscles are stretched more than they usually are, and overloaded, where they are trained more than normally and expected to exert a greater force more regularly than is typical. So understretch, overstretch, underload, overload are our 4 types of mechanical stimuli. So before we jump ahead any further, let's think about strength and how we define strength, because these are the factors that can affect strength. But what is strength? And I encourage you now just to pause the video for a moment and think about that question. What is strength? How would you define strength? And the reason I ask this is because it's a notoriously difficult concept to define. And the reason for that is multifaceted. One, your muscles are able to produce varying amounts of force depending on the muscle action. So when you concentrically shorten a muscle, that is the muscle action that is able to produce the least amount of force, followed then by isometric and eccentric. Eccentric muscle actions are our strongest type of muscle action, where we can exert the greatest amount of force. The speed of the movement will determine how much force you can produce. As we've discussed before, speedy movements mean that force is going to be down. However, slower movements is where you're able to produce greater amounts of force. So you have to factor in how fast the action that you're performing is taking place, and that will have an impact on the overall strength. The position that your limb is in is an awkward one. This comes to the force-length relationship, which we'll talk about in a moment, but basically if your muscle is in a fully shortened position or a lengthened position where it's being stretched, that is its weakest points. So it's somewhere in the middle, as we'll come to see later on, is where you're able to produce the most or the greatest amount of active force. Your age is obviously a big determinant of muscular strength. Your muscle fiber type composition. On the whole, in most people we have an average split of 50-50 between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, but those genetically gifted few will have a greater ratio of either type 1 or type 2. So Mo Farah, for example, is likely to have a greater ratio of type 1 muscle fibers in the body, whereas, let's say, Usain Bolt is more likely to have a greater ratio of type 2 fibers throughout his body. There are some muscles which typically have a greater ratio of either fiber type. So the soleus muscle has almost universally type 1 muscle fibers. So it's very resistant to fatigue, but can't produce a huge amount of force. Whereas the vastus lateralis has a high composition of type 2 muscle fibers. And the important thing to remember is that you cannot change a muscle's fiber type. You cannot shift it from a 1 to a 2. It can be done in a lab experimentally, but it won't take place in the human body. And finally, the mechanics of the movement you're performing, the position of the resistance that you're lifting. So, for example, we all know, I assume most of you are aware that when performing a squat, it's, I won't say easier, but you can produce more force when the barbell is positioned on your upper back as opposed to across your clavicle. So a back squat versus a front squat, you can produce far more force with the back squat and lift a greater load than you can the front squat. So what I'm getting at is it's hard to define strength, and basically it's in biomechanics we tend to almost not even bother defining it. We tend to just look at each of these individual factors and consider them either in isolation or collectively, and almost disregard the term strength and just stick with force production. But it's still a worthwhile question worth pondering. Okay, these graphs, perhaps not the most exciting graphs you'll ever see, but there's more going on here than you perhaps think. So, what this shows is the change in muscle architecture. It's taken from, on the left here, a study by Gruther et al. 2008, and De Freitas, I can never pronounce that, 2011. So they're separate studies. And essentially, the study on the left by Gruther looked at the effect of underloading, reducing the amount of daily stimulus, on the volume of the muscle, and De Freitas, the study on the right, looked at the effect of overloading, so just performing weeks of resistance exercise on the cross-sectional area of the muscle. So here we have change in muscle volume here up the y-axis, and number of days here on the x-axis here. So in the case of underloading and understretching, which would come as a consequence, you can see that there is a rapid decrease in muscle volume. So you only have to, on average, not train or stop training. If we go from this point here, we go from the average line here, for 20 days to lose almost half of your muscle volume, which is shocking to say the least. However, it takes, in the example given here, about 10 weeks to gain less than 10% of a change in muscle architecture, which comes to the phrase that's sometimes used when talking about skeletal muscles and the overall mechanics of them as use it or lose it. You will lose muscle volume far quicker than you can gain it, and once you've lost it, it's harder to get it back. So don't be lazy is the theme that we're saying here. Around about this point here, you see there's a rapid increase, relatively speaking, in muscle cross-sectional area here on the right hand image, but it begins to plateau by about week 10, and this is where we would look to apply a different training modality. One of the reasons for this difference is overloading a muscle is a stimulus that is applied in small intervals, essentially, so in small bouts of exercise several times throughout a week, whereas an underloading stimulus, if you're just being told, right, don't exercise for several weeks, that's going to be a stimulus which is applied to the muscle as soon as you stop exercising, as soon as you start detraining. So it's a more pronounced stimulus in the body. Okay, so what we have here is the force-length relationship. It's important to understand this before we move on. In the middle here, roughly where this red line begins, pretty much straight down the middle of this graph, would be the muscle's resting position. And by resting position we mean the length that the muscle is at for the majority of the time throughout the day. Up the y-axis we measure force, and on the x-axis we measure the length of the muscle. So if we start from this point here, movement to the left in this direction, obviously, of that point results in the muscle shortening. So you could think of this as a concentric muscle action, and once you get all the way to here, you've fully shortened the muscle. So if you think of your arm as, if you place your elbow at 90 degrees by your side, and we say that's your starting position, that's your resting length. It's not, but just for the sake of a demonstration. If you then flex the elbow, bringing your hand up to your shoulder, then that is a leftward shift along the x-axis here. Now if you go back to the starting point, elbow at 90 degrees, and extend the elbow until it's fully extended, that results in a lengthening of the muscle, which is a rightward shift from this midpoint here. So this is a general overview of the force-length relationship, but it does vary for each muscle. There is the active force position might be different, as would the passive, but the general shape is still the same. So this blue line here, this almost bell curve, represents the active force that your muscle is able to produce at varying lengths. So this active force comes from myosin and actin, as we said before. The red line represents the passive force that is produced in the muscle. You notice you can produce a lot more passive force than you can active force. This is the force that is produced when your muscle is being stretched and placed under a stretch. The dotted line represents a combination of the two. So you can see here there is a noticeable dip where active force reduces and passive force comes online to compensate for it. The purpose of this sharp rise in passive force output is to prevent damage to the muscle, prevent it from being injured. But you are strongest somewhere in the mid-range of the muscle, so the biceps brachii is strongest and able to produce the greatest amount of force with your elbow at roughly 90 degrees. This passive force, if you were to perform a stretch on your biceps brachii, the active force producing units of your muscle, the sarcomeres, are stretched out too far to be able to produce any significant amount of force. So the force that is coming from the muscle when you're stretching comes from the passive connective tissue in the muscle. Everything that isn't myosin and actin, the collagen, the titin, the desmin, the alpha-actinin, the various proteins that make up a muscle, which don't contribute to active force but are still there. If you fully shorten a muscle, then obviously there's no passive force that's going to come from it, but your active force also reduces, and this is because the sarcomeres are reaching a point where they're fully shortened. To fully shorten your bicep, if you're interested, you need to put your arm vertically above your head, so in a position of shoulder flexion, and then flex your elbow as you normally would. So shoulder flexion and bicep flexion will result in a fully shortened bicep. So, how do overload and underload affect the force length relationship? Well, in terms of the active force portion of the force length relationship, then it's fairly obvious, really. So again, up the y-axis we have force, x-axis we have length. Underloading a muscle is in this sort of, I don't know, sort of teal colour, I suppose you call it. I don't know. Results in a downward shift in this curve here. So this is where we start to detrain our muscles. The active force shifts downwards here, so we simply can't produce as much force as we could previously. And somewhat obviously, if you overload the muscle, then obviously there's going to be a greater amount of active force production. So an upward shift in the curve. Again, fairly straightforward. There we go. Forgot I'd added that in. Never mind. Over and under stretch are somewhat different though, particularly in terms of how they affect the passive force output of the muscle. So movement, so this dotted line represents the starting point, let's say, and anything to the left, which is this dark blue colour here of this dotted line, represents a muscle that is kept in a shortened position, has reduced stretch. Another good example, now I think of it, is someone, if you've ever broken your arm and you've had your arm in a sling, broken a bone in your arm, then you have your arm up in a sling where your bicep is kept in a fully shortened position for as long as it needs for your injury to heal. So that will result in understretch of the bicep. Everything to the right of this dotted line, for example, stretching here, whatever this person's doing, results in a rightward shift of the passive force output of the muscle. This means that at any given length, the muscle is able to exert less force. So if we look at the dotted line here where my cursor is, let's say after a week stretching, the passive force output shifts to here, the line next to it. Well, that means to produce the same amount of force, we've had to lengthen the muscle, and to at the position the muscle was previously in, producing that amount of force is reduced. So the length has reduced, and there has been a rightward shift. So maximal force stays the same, that doesn't change, but at any given length with overstretch, the overall passive force of the muscle will reduce, which is one reason why we need to be careful not to overstretch too much with particularly heavy resistance exercise. A rule of thumb would be to perform as much exercise stretching as you need to safely and correctly perform the exercise, but no more. If you can't perform a squat properly, then you need to stretch until you can. But you don't need to be able to perform, I don't know, some sort of ballet maneuver where you've got your leg up and over your head, for example. In terms of the active force component, understretch and overstretch do not alter the overall force output of the muscle, but again they cause a leftward and rightward shift. Understretch causing a leftward shift, meaning maximal force output occurs at a shorter length. Right, overstretching means that maximal active force occurs at a longer length, and it's again, we won't discuss it today, it's a story for another time, but there are potential implications for this. But the main thing you need to take away is the effect that overstretch and understretch has on the force length relationship, as well as overload and underload. So we come back to our question that we asked at the beginning. Why so many muscles? Well, it was a trick question. We don't really know. And I know that's a bit anticlimactic, but there we are. The leading theory is that in the case of the quadriceps, you have 4 knee extensors. If one of them is injured, then you have 3 other muscles that can help take over and perform that movement whilst the other one repairs and heals. So very few movements in your body would you have a singular muscle that performs that movement. There are always supporting muscles there to provide support, an additional force to support that movement. And it also means that less stress is placed on a single muscle, as opposed to having many hands make light work, essentially. So there we are. That's our session on the skeletal muscle system.